Unusual as this may sound with all the drama that's happening here, just outside this building, there are tens of thousands of people, most of them students, that are gathered in Washington, D.C. preparing for something called the March for Life. This has happened for decades now. For students and adults that come from all over the country to be able to come to Washington, D.C. to quietly speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, children still in the womb, to be able to speak out for the protection of life. It's an interesting conversation that has a tremendous amount of science and a tremendous amount of faith and a tremendous amount of heat around it. As some individuals don't want to discuss the issue of abortion or would simply say that's a woman's choice, need to set that aside and ignore it, there are a whole group of students that are rising up and saying, wait a minute, that child in the womb has 10 fingers and 10 toes, unique DNA that's different than the mom, different than the dad. The child feels pain in the womb, has a beating heart. That doesn't sound like tissue to me. That sounds like a child. They're raising great issues that, quite frankly, science reinforces as well. Last week, I had the opportunity to be able to stop by one of the great research facilities in Oklahoma. They're doing tremendous research on cancer, on MS, on Alzheimer's, and a lot more. And I stopped by one of the labs and talked to one of the scientists there. They're actually doing research on zebrafish. Now, as odd as this may sound, they're actually taking zebrafish eggs, developing those eggs. As they're first beginning to hatch out of the eggs, they're injecting them with a gene that's a gene that they know to be cancerous in humans, allowing that to be able to develop in the zebrafish, seeing the abnormalities there, and then they try to treat it with different drugs to be able to see if they can, once they get the abnormality, see if they can reverse it. They're literally taking zebrafish, creating problems, and then seeing if they can fix them, and they're going into great detail. The microscopes, the work, the millions of dollars that have gone into this research, all for one simple thing: the ability to be able to cure diseases that affect human life. We have, as a culture, determined that life is valuable. Human life, especially, is valuable and precious. The challenge that we have is determining when that life begins. Myself and millions of others believe life begins at conception. When that child has different DNA than the mom or the dad, that tissue is not just the mom's tissue at that point, it's growing independently. There's no difference in that child in the womb and the child that's in the backyard playing and laughing going down the slide other than time. There's no difference. Last year, Cleveland Cavaliers guard J.R. Harris and his wife had little Dakota. And when I say little Dakota, I mean little Dakota. She was born at less than a pound, at 19 weeks of development. She left the hospital 5 months later at 7 pounds 4 ounces, or 7 pounds 5 ounces actually. When she left the hospital, it was a remarkable event. It was celebrated all over social media for this guard for the NBA Cleveland Cavaliers and this beautiful child leaving. Dakota's now a year old. And it's been interesting, the stir that happened around her birth, as a lot of people stopped and thought about a child that small and that young. But it was interesting, the CNN articles that came out at the same time as little Dakota's birth noted that a child at 23 weeks of development has a 50 to 60% chance of survival now. The science has changed a lot over the last several decades. A lot's happening. It's remarkable to hear the stories of surgery that's happening in utero. In 1995, Roberto Rodriguez actually went through surgery still in the womb. He had major problems in his left lung. And at 20 weeks, they went in and did surgery in utero, fixing his left lung, allowed him to finish out. 13 weeks later, he was delivered healthy. Little Roberto Rodriguez is now 22 years old. This technology is not new anymore. In many ways, the science has far surpassed what our conversation is here in America, dealing with policy around children. The Supreme Court back in the 1970s, when they passed Roe v. Wade, had this whole conversation about viability, and that government has a right to be able to step in and protect children at their moment that they're viable. Well, in the 1970s, that was very different than what it is now. Now we see children at 21, 20, 22 weeks of development being born and being natural, healthy, great children. We need to be able to catch up. in law. We may disagree on a lot of things on life. As I've already stated, I believe life begins at conception. But in this body, I know there's a lot of conversation to say, how do we actually get to a sense of commonality and common ground on these issues? Well, let me just lay down 3 different areas that I would say maybe we can find some common ground on these 3 areas. Though we may disagree on when life begins, can we at least agree that Americans should have freedom of conscience? Can we at least agree on late-term abortions when a child is clearly viable? And can we at least agree that when a child is born alive, they should be protected? Let me just hit those 3 very quickly. The first one is this basic freedom of conscience, allowing an individual to be able to live out their conscience. I spoke to several nurses just a few months ago. Those nurses, when they were hired at the hospitals that they worked in, told the individuals in HR and the physicians they work with, they believe that life begins at conception. And they had a moral and conscience belief that they wanted to protect children. And they were told at that moment, you will not have to participate in abortions. We understand your conscious belief will protect your conscious belief. And for years, they did not. And then suddenly, they ran short in nurses at one moment, and they pulled each of them in at different times in different hospitals in different states. They told stories of them being pulled into a procedure, being told on the way in, we need you in this procedure, arriving only to find out it was an abortion they were being forced to assist with. They were appalled to be a part of the death of a child rather than protecting the life of a child. But each of them was told, you will lose your job if you don't participate in the taking of this child's life. That's an unfair place to be able to put them in. Individuals should be able to have the freedom of conscience and to be able to live out their moral and spiritual beliefs. I would never go to an abortion doctor and force him to peacefully protest against his own abortion clinic. That would be absurd. But for some reason, pro-abortion hospitals see no issue at times compelling a staff member to participate in something they find objectionable, even when they made their stance clear. We should never force a person to administer a lethal injection in a prison if they have a moral objection to the death penalty. That seems only reasonable. We're rightfully furious when a man threatens a woman with firing if she doesn't respond to his advances. No one would say if she doesn't like his advances, she can just go find another job. But for some in our culture, they want to look away when that same man threatens a woman with firing if she doesn't violate her conscience and help perform an abortion. They're willing to tell her, just quit and go find another job. What's the difference? We wouldn't compel a vegan to eat meat at the company barbecue, would we? Why would we compel a person to assist in the taking of a life when they're personally offended by the practice? The right of conscience should be protected for every person. Religious intolerance is a personal choice, not a legal requirement in America. Late-term abortions are another area that I think we should find common ground on and should be able to protect these children. We should agree that elective late-term abortions should be ended in America. This is an elective abortion after 5 months of pregnancy. When the child's nervous system is fully developed, they can feel pain at that point. We in America, because of the pro-abortion lobby and the activists that are around, have lost track of this simple fact. We are one of 7 nations in the world that allow elective abortions after 22 weeks of gestation. In fact, of those 7 nations that allow abortions after 22 weeks of gestation, 3 of those, Canada, Singapore, and the Netherlands, allow elective abortions only until 24 weeks, just 2 weeks later. But there are only 4 countries in the world that allow elective abortions at any moment. You ready for this club? 4 nations that are like us: the United States, Vietnam, North Korea, and China. That's it. Those 4 nations allow elective abortions at any stage like we do. That is a horrible club for the United States of America to be in. Those are some of the worst human rights violators in the world. And that's the elite club that we find ourselves in. The pro-abortion lobby is so powerful and is so wealthy, and they're so engaged, they're not willing to even relent that even one child's life could be protected, even when they're clearly viable, leaving the United States in this horrible collection with Vietnam, North Korea, and China on abortion policy. At 5 months old, a child in the womb can kick, stretch, yawn, smile, suck its thumb, and feel pain. It's a viable child. Late-term abortions represent only 1.3% of all abortions in America. I would contend we should stop this practice altogether. 191 nations already do, that they don't allow this. 191 nations. There's no reason we should not as well. It's interesting, the Washington Post heard several people quote that statistic about 7 nations are the only nations that actually allow any abortions this late in the stage. Those 4 that I mentioned, the Netherlands, Canada, and Singapore, allow it up to 24 weeks, but not after that. So they ran their famous fact checker on this issue. And the Washington Post ran through all of it, looked at it saying, this sounds like this is not correct. Except they ran through the whole study, looked at it, fact-checked the whole thing, and at the end of it came back and said, no, it actually is correct. What seemed a dubious statement in the beginning, they fact-checked and gave what the Washington Post calls their elite Geppetto qualification. That means no Pinocchio's, true statement. We should be able to resolve this. I've made no secret that I believe that life begins at conception. But I would say to this group, not everyone agrees with me on this, but we should at least be able to protect life when it's viable. Let me add one more detail to this that's painful to even discuss. Of those late-term abortions that occur, those 1.3% of those abortions that occur during this late time period, the child is too large and too well developed to actually have a traditional abortion procedure. So the abortions are done by the abortion doctor reaching in with a tool into the womb and literally pulling the child's arms and legs off, allowing the child to bleed to death in the womb, and then pulling its parts out a piece at a time. Why do we allow that in America? 191 other nations do not. All of Europe does not. When's the last time you heard me say, our social policy needs to catch up with Europe? We're better than this. Last statement, and I have some colleagues that want to be able to join me in this conversation as well. We should be able to agree on a simple principle that if an abortion is conducted and yet it's botched, and instead of destroying the child in the womb, the abortion doctor actually induces the delivery. In those rare cases, the current practice is when the child is delivered, everyone in the operating room backs away and allows the child to die of exposure on the table. Because they can't actually take the life anymore, it's been fully delivered. Kermit Gosnell sits in prison right now because as an abortionist in Philadelphia, he was in the practice of delivering children and then killing them after they were delivered. So it's a crime already to be able to physically take the life of that individual. So the current practice is if they mess up the abortion and deliver instead of destroy, they just allow the child to die on its own, crying on the table. Can we, as Congress and as Americans, at least agree that it is barbaric to watch a crying child on the table slowly die? That at least at that moment of delivery, we would agree a child is a child when we can see all 10 of their fingers, see all 10 of their toes, and hear their voice crying on the table. This is an issue that shouldn't be controversial. This is an issue that we should find great compassion. And I would challenge this body when we deal with conscience and we deal with late-term abortions and we deal with children that are born alive, that we find resolution in those areas. I'm aware this is a difficult topic. I understand for many people in this conversation, it's painful to even consider it. And for the millions of women who have experienced abortion in their personal life, that this is painful to even consider. But I'm also aware that until we talk about these hard issues and resolve them, it will continue to advance. We're better than this as a nation. Let's prove it in the way that we treat our most vulnerable. With that, Mr. President, I would ask for a time of colloquy time with some of my colleagues and would like to be able to recognize Senator Blunt from Missouri.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm
Senator from Missouri.
here with the Senator from Oklahoma, and we're about to be joined by the Senator from Iowa to talk about a topic that Senator Lankford just said is difficult to talk about. When you actually stand up and explain what's going on, it's hard to imagine that we still let these things happen. And Senator Lankford, you know, one thing I'd suggest that we could talk about is the fact that the minds of people have changed on this, and almost all change once you explain the two things that the Congress is focused on this year. Polling on this, I believe 63% of all Americans now believe that these late-term abortions should not be allowed to occur. Many, as you well pointed out, the countries that allow this to happen are not the countries whose social policies you'd want to be aligned with. China, North Korea, who have a stated purpose of eliminating children just for no other reason than population control, and they wind up eliminating more female children than male children in that process, because apparently their belief is that the male child has more economic value going forward. Why would we want to be aligned with countries that look at these issues that way, or just simply think that that pain should be allowed? The House has passed the pain-capable bill, and where are we now in the House on the Born Alive bill? Is it to be voted on this week, or has it been voted on already, Senator?
So in colloquy, the House has passed both a pain-capable and an infant protection born alive. In a prior month, the Senate has yet to take that up, and it is our hope in the Senate to be able to bring that up for real dialogue in conversation in the days ahead.
I think the pain-capable bill was passed by the House in October. We have thousands of Americans coming this week, focusing on tomorrow to talk about this issue. These two bills are two of their priorities, but of course their priority is to honor life. The March for Life is designed to do exactly that. And it clearly, the March for Life in its 45th year now is not a celebration. It's not an anniversary of celebration. Rather, it's a time to remember that there's a lot that we still need to do to ensure that our society is a society that values every human life, no matter how small, no matter how vulnerable, no matter how little capacity that life has to protect itself. And the way that the society, I think, has decided to deal with this is looking at things like partial birth abortion, the description of which was every bit as bad as the dismembering abortions, but the Congress stepped forward on that topic. Some people who performed that particular act didn't stop doing it, but they're in trouble when you find out they have done it. So thousands of people from all over the country, in fact, tens of thousands of people. It's a number that I believe is always underreported based on looking at the March for Life crowd and any other crowds we see here. I guarantee that the final number, if you take any of those crowds and look at them, you believe that there is a willingness to ignore the thousands of people that come in buses from all over the country in the worst possible weather, more years than not, to stand up and say, we don't want this to happen. Young people, I think, are increasingly more and more defensive of the idea of life and are more and more offended by the places where we've chosen not to draw the line. How could you possibly justify a baby that's born alive and the process that Senator Lankford just described, where you can't take that life, but you can step back and not do anything to save that life, or the uniquely troubled countries we're involved in that allow developed children, boys and girls, 10 fingers, 10 toes, the ability to feel pain, to inflict that pain on those children at that time. The American people don't support this. Almost nobody who understands what's going on supports it, but if you're asking polling, I think it's, as I said earlier, 63%, more than 6 out of 10 Americans say, how could we be continuing to let that happen? So supporting those who come here, responding to those who understand this, and certainly the two senators on the floor here, the senator from Iowa, the senator from Oklahoma, are among the best advocates for life, among the best advocates for getting information out about life, about adoption, about what happens that our laws allow that the laws of other countries don't allow. And certainly I'll be welcoming the March to Life this year from Missouri and other states. The vice president last year became the first vice president in the history of the country to speak to the March for Life and made it clear where his views were and where the administration is. The missing component here to do the right thing is the Congress itself. We have an opportunity to step up and do that. We need to have this debate on the floor because people, once they enter into this debate, realize it's not a debate that they want to be in, because the wrong side of this is the side where slightly more than a handful of countries allow to happen what we allow to happen. And I'm pleased to be here on the floor with Senator Lankford and Senator Ernst. And Senator Ernst, I'm going to turn to you now.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank my colleagues. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank my colleagues from Oklahoma, Missouri, and we'll be joined shortly by the senator from Montana as well. And Mr. President, I'm rising today to discuss the importance of protecting and celebrating life. As I travel across the state of Iowa, I have had the opportunity to hear directly from families whose lives have been changed by the innovative, life-affirming services offered by their local pregnancy resource center. And there are so many more stories of vulnerable lives saved all across the country, not just in Iowa, but all across the country. So I would like to begin by recognizing the critical on-the-ground actions of these pregnancy resource centers, maternity homes, and adoption agencies across the country that are changing and saving lives. And I want to thank them for all that they do. Since coming to Washington, I've tried to hold Congress accountable to do its part to protect the most vulnerable in our society. The senator from Missouri just mentioned that we can measure a society, and ours is a great society, but we can do more to protect those that are vulnerable. For example, last January, I introduced legislation to defund Planned Parenthood while protecting women's health care centers. As I have stated time and again, taxpayers should not be forced to foot the bill for roughly $500 million annually for an organization like Planned Parenthood that exhibits such disrespect for human life. Despite what they may claim otherwise, Planned Parenthood is not the nation's preeminent provider of women's health care. For example, Planned Parenthood facilities don't even perform in-house mammograms. They don't do that. Community health centers, on the other hand, continue to greatly outnumber Planned Parenthoods. They provide greater preventative primary health care services regardless of a person's ability to pay. Additionally, last April, President Trump signed my legislation into law that ensures states are not forced to provide entities like Planned Parenthood, the nation's single largest provider of abortions, with federal Title X dollars. I'm grateful to have worked with Congresswoman Diane Black, a dear friend in the House, my Senate colleagues who are with me here today, and President Trump to make sure states are not forced to award providers like Planned Parenthood with taxpayer dollars through Title X family planning grants. Another effort my colleagues and I continue to work on is passing Senator Graham's pain-capable Unborn Child Protection Act right here in the Senate. Whenever I discuss this bill, I cannot help but share the remarkable story of a very special family from Newton, Iowa. In July 2012, Micah Pickering was born prematurely at just 20 weeks. 20 weeks post-fertilization, the very age at which this bill would prohibit abortions. When he was born, Micah was only, if you can imagine it, Micah was only about the size of a bag of M&Ms, about the size of the palm of my hand. Yet Micah was still a perfectly formed baby with 10 fingers and 10 toes. Now, when I first met Micah, he was just a few years old, and he came to visit me in my office. And we had a photo of Micah when he was just born. Again, folks, the size of the palm of my hand, a little bag of M&Ms. That photo, I had it in my office. Little Micah ran up to that photo, and he pointed at it, and he said, "Baby." And we said, "Yes, Micah, that's a baby. That's a baby." Just a few months ago, I had the opportunity to visit again with Micah and his parents at my office here in DC. And I can attest that now at 5 years old, Micah remains a happy, healthy, energetic little boy. Stories like Micah show all of us that at 5 months, an unborn child is a child. Just as Micah would say, a baby. There is also significant scientific evidence that at 5 months of development, these babies can feel pain. Yet there is no federal law protecting these vulnerable babies from abortion. As a result, every year in our country, the lives of thousands of babies, just like Micah, end painfully through abortion. Currently, the United States is one of only 7 countries to allow abortions at 5 months of gestation. We're in the company of China and North Korea. Folks, this is unacceptable. There is much work to be done in the ongoing fight to protect life. We understand that. But as folks from across the country travel to Washington to March for Life this week, I'm urging my colleagues to join me in calling for a vote on this critical legislation that recognizes these unborn babies as the children they are and provides them the same protection from pain and suffering that all of our children deserve. Again, as Micah Pickering would say, a baby. Thank you.
Mr. President, I'd like to ask Senator Sass to also join in from Nebraska from this colloquy as well.
Thank you very much to the senator from Oklahoma, and thank you to the senator from Montana for spelling me. I'm sitting in the presiding chair during this colloquy, so not on the ground floor to be able to speak and participate, but I'd like to associate myself with this colloquy and with the leadership of the senators from Oklahoma, Missouri, Iowa, and Montana. I too know Micah, and it is an amazing thing. I wish that all 100 senators in this body had a chance to know Micah and his family, and I also want to associate myself with the comments of the senator from Oklahoma as you began this, that we are one of only 4 countries in the world that allow elective abortion at any time for any reason. Our peers in this are North Korea, China, and Vietnam, and it is a genuine shame. And the American people need to understand that, and this body needs to grapple with that reality. And as the senator from Missouri said, it is special to be a part of the rally and the march of the next 36 hours, because the college kids who are coming here, they understand this far better than the general public. There is a movement in this country to want to respect and celebrate life, and good things are happening generationally in this cause. And I just wanted to associate myself with this colloquy and thank the senator from Montana for spelling me from the chair. Thank you.
Mr. President, this is a difficult issue for so many people because it is intensely personal for so many people. We understand full well the grief that some families have when this topic comes up, because there are millions of men and women who they know their child has been aborted. We get that. We want to experience incredible compassion over them as they've struggled through some of the most difficult decisions of their life. We understand that when they go to the mall and they watch a small child laugh in the food court at the mall, they wonder in the back of their head, would that have sounded like my child when they laughed? We get the grief that they live with for the rest of their life as they process through what some physician told them was tissue, but in their heart they know is a child. This is a nation that we can set some basic principles to be able to help those individuals, to be able to promote adoption, to be able to encourage those families and to help walk alongside of them. We're good at grace and compassion as a nation. We can continue to be better at it. One of the ways we've got to be able to express that is for the most vulnerable, for those children that have yet to be born. With that, Mr. President, I'd like to invite the senator from Montana to also join into this colloquy.
Senator Lankford, thank you. Thank you for leading this effort here today, this very important conversation. I also want to thank Senator Blunt, Senator Ernst, Senator Sass for joining us today as well in this discussion. Mr. President, 28 years ago, I became a first-time dad, and by the grace of God, we got to see 3 more children born after our first child, David, was born. I can tell you my wife, Cindy, and I, we were excited, a little bit terrified when we welcomed David into the world. And as a parent, I think one of the most toughest things is to see your child in pain. I remember when David cried, I would have given an arm and a leg to stop that pain. I remember when just a little baby taking David to the pediatrician, maybe to get that shot and so forth, and the pain David felt and the screams and the crying, I think it was much, much harder on the parents than on the baby. And I think we all recognize the pain a child feels after they're born. But as I've got on and researched this issue of pain and babies and so forth, the science tells us that a baby feels pain before they're born. And Senator Sass mentioned earlier that we are one of the few nations that allows elective abortion at any time during a pregnancy, one of 4 any time during a pregnancy. The question is, if we were 1 hour before delivery, the baby's 1 hour from being delivered, As a nation, can we at least agree that we should have a law that says abortion should not be allowed? Because it's pretty clear that that baby's going to feel pain. The question is, at what point do we know that they feel pain during the pregnancy? It's shocking to think that our nation loses 13,000 children a year to late-term abortion. Now, of course, we can have the debate, and we should have the debate about all abortions, but really we're focused on today on late-term abortions. 13,000 children a year die to late-term abortion. At 20 weeks, these babies can suck their thumb, they can yawn, they can stretch, they can make faces, and the science shows these babies are also capable of feeling pain. Our ears may be deaf to their cries, but we don't have to live in ignorance. Not when research and even common sense tells us these unborn children feel pain. In fact, there's a reason that unborn babies are oftentimes given anesthesia during fetal surgery. That's why we must pass the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. It is unconscionable that we are allowing unborn children as old as 20 weeks, that's 5 months, to be killed when they can feel pain. In fact, do a Google search. If you have a smartphone, sitting in front of a computer, type in 20 weeks. That Google's, you don't have to type in even baby, just type in 20 weeks. And then take a look at the pictures, the images that come up after you complete that search. This is one of them. In fact, I just had my smartphone last night, and I said to my staff, I typed in 20 weeks in the Google search. This is the image that comes up. How can we say that that is not a baby? And while much of the media turned a blind eye to the atrocious acts of Kermit Gosnell, and they didn't watch the horrific videos taken undercover at Planned Parenthood clinics, many of us did. We did watch. And we cannot sit in silence. Most of us would not wish that treatment on even our most hated of enemies, let alone a child of any age. The U.S. is just one of 7 countries that allows elective abortions after 20 weeks. It's not a good list to be on. It's the same list that we share that has China and North Korea on it. As an American citizen, I believe in our founding principle that all men, all women are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As a person of faith, I am called, we are called, to help the most vulnerable in our society. And as a United States Senator, it is my honor to support this legislation, the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. And I urge its swift passage.
Mr. President, this has just been a dialogue, colloquy here on the floor. I thank Senator Daines from Montana, Senator Blunt from Missouri, Senator Ernst from Iowa, Senator Sass from Nebraska, joining in just on a dialogue in this basic issue of life. 1973, Roe v. Wade passed through the Supreme Court in their decision, and a split decision there this week in 1973. We still have this dialogue. There's still an ongoing argument about looking into the womb. We know a lot more now about science now than they knew in 1973. We knew a lot more about the development of a child now than what they knew in 1973. And we're still having this ongoing debate that I think is a righteous debate, quite frankly. I think it's entirely appropriate for us to be able to talk about these kind of difficult issues and to try to find some resolution. The American people have these dialogues. We should have them here and to be able to bring the debate to the forefront. It's not about people that we hate, and it's always interesting to be able to get the dialogue and pushback from people saying, you just hate people because of whatever reason. It's not true. It's actually that we love children. That's really the issue. There's a vulnerable child in the middle of this conversation that sometimes they don't seem to come up in the conversation about protecting rights or about giving people privacy, and all those things are wonderful euphemisms, but in the middle of that, there's a very small child that's being discussed. We're trying to elevate their voice, to literally speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. We think that's an appropriate role for government, to speak out for the most vulnerable and see if we can find justice for those individuals. This week is not only the week that we have the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, it's also the week that we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I would say he's a terrific role model in this conversation. His basic teaching that hate doesn't win over a friend, only love can do that. Only love can transform an enemy into a friend. That's what we're trying to do. To people that oppose this idea, we get it. We can have that dialogue. You're not our enemy, though. And quite frankly, we want to respond to your comments in love and say, let's sit down and have a reasonable dialogue. Let us express our affection for children and be able to talk about how valuable they really are in our society. Let's talk about adoption. Let's talk about ways to be able to continue to take care of those. But in the middle of it, let's talk about a child as a child, not as just tissue that's random. Because tissue that's just random doesn't suck its thumb and smile back at you, doesn't stretch and yawn. That's a child that does that. We want to be able to have that conversation. I would urge this body to stop ignoring what millions of the American people see as the issue. Let's talk about the child, and let's see where we're going to go. I think a good first step for us to be able to talk about this is the Infant Protection Born Alive bill, the late-term, what we call the pain-capable bill, dealing with late-term abortions that are very late, 5 months and later, and the issue of conscience. Are we really going to compel people to perform procedures they find morally reprehensible in the destruction of a child rather than the protection of a child? We should be able to find common ground on those. And then let's keep the conversation going, because it's a reasonable thing for us to be able to discuss. If we can't talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in this place, where could we talk about it? So again, I thank my colleagues for participating, and your tenacity and your compassion and your affection for all Americans, whether they agree or disagree on this issue. I appreciate very much your engagement, and I appreciate very much the volunteers scattered around the country right now that are serving women in some of the most difficult moments of their life. Crisis pregnancy centers and women's resource centers and other locations where they're volunteering, they're providing clothes, they're providing help, they're providing sonograms and pregnancy tests, and they're walking those families through those tough days. Thanks to those volunteers wherever they may be as well today, and bless you for the ongoing work that you have.